We know that Russia has been sending missiles and drones into Ukraine. It was only fairly recently the biggest drone attack on Ukraine happened. This has been a situation where Russia has been, I think, testing how far it can get away in terms of a response. Europe also is feeling quite vulnerable at the moment, and the fact that the Americans sent a B-52 nuclear bomber up again highlights that America is still very much involved in NATO security, and Russia has to react to that as well. So it's a bit of cat and mouse, if you want to call it that. So the situation is very much, I don't want to say it's escalatory, but neither side can be seen to back down. So if America sends a nuclear bomber up, Russia has to do it, vice versa. If Russia does it, someone has to do it. They have to send up planes to scramble and deal with the situation. That's been the case since 2014. So it is very much just tit for tat, I would say. Well, its significance is sending a message that Russia has the capacity to do this in the same way that America was sending a message to its NATO allies that America will maintain its support for NATO. It's, again, as I said, Europe feels vulnerable at the moment, especially after what happened in the Munich Security Conference, when Europe was blamed pretty much for being anti-democratic and allowing mass migration. So Pete Hegseth also talked about the end of the transatlantic security architecture. So naturally, Europe felt vulnerable. America highlighted that it's still going to be there, at least in some capacity. And because it was a closer to the Russian border, Russia obviously has to also act as well, again, highlighting we can do this and we have the nuclear capacity, we have the capacity to do this. It will possibly also be one of the usual Russian cycles of nuclear blackmail to the West. There is this feeling that if America does pull out, it will take its nuclear arsenal with it, and Europe will be left with 500 nuclear weapons, which is Russia has 5,500 of them. So you do the math in terms of who has the more nuclear capacity should America leave. Well, I think it highlights that Vladimir Putin isn't necessarily concerned with peace. I mean, he's talked about finding a deal with the Americans for natural resources, which I can't imagine has ever really considered, he's ever crossed his mind. It's either that the Russian economy is that close to collapse and Putin is desperately trying to hold on, or he's trying to split, more likely he's trying to split the Western alliance and support for Ukraine. On top of that, Russia has had deals in the past with companies like BP in regards to oil, but oil is a strategic asset considered by the Russian state, and therefore it's unlikely to ever allow the Americans too much control over those strategic assets. So it is very much a cat and mouse game in trying to get the Americans to blink first. I don't think Putin wants negotiations. He's quite clear that, as in fairness, are other members of his regime, that the ceasefire is something they don't want. They don't want to be led by the nose, their famous phrase saying that they've been lied to. They don't want to be led by the nose. They don't want a new Minsk. They want to get the solution as quickly as possible. And it should ideally be a demilitarization of Ukraine, neutrality for Ukrainian government that will still work with Russia, which can only be a pro-Russian government because there are, unless the FSB and the SVR have managed to buy off all other Ukrainian politicians apart from Zelensky, there isn't a pro-Russian politician in the here and now. They would have to impose someone. So it is, I don't think that the Kremlin really wants negotiations. The economy is on a war footing. Winning it off a war footing will be very difficult. He's quite happy to spin these talks out and hopefully thinking that one, he's winning the war, and two, Donald Trump is going to get bored. Donald Trump wants a peace agreement quickly and therefore will give Russia what it wants in order to do that. And we've sort of seen that to an extent in terms of Donald Trump tried to bully Russia by saying we'll impose more sanctions on you. Didn't happen. So he moved to Ukraine and has called Zelensky a dictator, said he's had 4% of the vote, and given Ukrainians a natural resource deal that would effectively turn them into a colony and said, sign here. So Yes, it is, I think, for Putin, the idea that in his perception, he's winning the war, and that Donald Trump is going to get bored and eventually just give him what he wants. The Kremlin is still pushing the Russian economy to a war footing. It's still concerned with the war. And if it doesn't see strong signals from the Western states in both America and Europe, it will keep on pushing. And so this is certainly a very I want to say tempestuous time. We simply don't know what's going to happen in the next few weeks. We don't even know what's going to happen in the next few days. What Donald Trump says one day changes by the next week. There's apparently going to be, according to Die Welt, a German newspaper, talks in Saudi Arabia between American and Russian progenitors, and we're going towards, and Europe and Ukraine have not been invited again. So we'll simply have to see as to what is actually happening. But Europe really needs to start putting its foot on the gas in terms of developing a military infrastructure and deciding on what it's going to be. Is it going to do its traditional thing of being an ostrich and putting its head in the sand, or is it going to realize that it needs to be seen, at the very least, to promote its own security? Sir Keir Starmer is going to Washington on Thursday. Allegedly, he was going to tell Donald Trump that Britain is going to spend more on its military, from 2.3 to 2.5, insignificant amounts, and that won't impress Donald Trump. Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand decimal points. So that needs to go from 2.3 to 3% almost immediately. And that means that Sir Keir Starmer is going to have to talk to his electorate as to how he's going to be able to balance the budget that still maintains our welfare system and what we benefit from, and also increased militarization. And that's something that all European politicians are going to have to discuss with their electorates at some point, and it has to be fit soon. Well, I think it will change the UK's role. I mean, we're waiting on the defence review. The idea was that the UK was going to pivot towards Asia. I suspect that pivot is not going to happen. Europe is going to pivot, but Britain is going to pivot, but it's going to be to Europe. And there needs to be greater decisions over what Britain can provide for the security, not just of itself, but also of its European allies and of Ukraine. It's very much the case that, unfortunately, for better or worse, this war is unlikely to be solved anytime soon, especially if it involves Donald Trump handing Ukraine on a plate to Putin. The Ukrainians won't accept it. That continues the war, and Europe does not want the instability. So there needs to be a decision made between European elites as to where they're going to go with this, supporting Ukraine and having to rely on less support coming from America, at least for the next 4 years, possibly longer. And that therefore would require that Britain starts spending significantly more on its defence than it already is doing and has said it will do. I believe that they said they'll be spending 3% of GDP by 2030 or 2035. That's nonsensical in a decade. I appreciate that it takes time to ramp things up, but Ukraine won't be here if that happens in 2035. And it's increasingly, and I don't want to sound like a pessimist or a doomsayer, but it seems to be increasingly, in my opinion, a question more of, well, I mean, it's no longer a question of if, it's a question of when. The only real question is where, in regards to what Russia will do next and to whom.